Glory to Jesus Christ, glory forever. Hey, this is Father Anthony, and we're next to my back porch in Hartwell, Georgia. Today, it's a real blessing. We've got Dr. Gayle Woloschak on with us. She's a wonderful friend and has been for years, since I became Ukrainian, basically. And she's doing fantastic work in so many different levels, and we're blessed that she's able to take some time today to talk with us. We're going to talk about some difficult subjects. It's difficult for some people, right? Vaccines and conspiracy theories, and what's the role of Orthodoxy? How can we find real discernment in the middle of this? Because we don't want to be deceived, right, in either direction. And Gayle, because of her expertise, her training in both science and in theology, and her life of prayer and worship, all these things have a payoff in this moment. And so it's a blessing to be able to talk with her. So we're going to begin, as we always do, with the Jesus prayer. Okay, so we'll do that with our square breathing, right? We'll do it 3 times. It'll be about a minute's worth of prayer. Okay, ready? Let's breathe in slowly. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God. Pause. Breathe out slowly. Have mercy on me, a sinner. Pause. Breathe in slowly. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God. Pause. Breathe out slowly. Have mercy on me, a sinner. Pause. Last time together today. Breathe in slowly. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God. Pause. Breathe out slowly. Have mercy on me, a sinner. Pause. Okay, let's resume our normal breathing. No dogs bark this time, so no huge legismoi, but of course you hear the birds. And I appreciate Father Gabriel saying, hey, a great interview yesterday with Father Gregory, but the birds, can you turn them down a bit? Yeah, I'll work on that. But let's bring in Dr. Gayle. She's been eating her blue and yellow M&Ms in the green room, and there she is. Oh, Gayle, it's so good to see you.
Good to see you too, Father. And I should note that my dogs may end up barking in the background too. I don't always have control over that.
Excellent. It's real life. So is that really your office behind you, or is this one of those?
This is my home office. This is where
Awesome.
this is my cubbyhole where I do most of my work. So
Fantastic. Fantastic. And it's your cell, right? So you're learning a lot about yourself.
you bet, you bet.
So, all right. So it's been a few weeks now. You put an article up on public orthodoxy, and it's called "Ready for the COVID Vaccine?" ? An Orthodox perspective. And in it, you address kind of 3 of the reservations that people have, and there are more, right? But these are the 3 big ones. And for some people, you're like, why are you talking about this? But no, this is a big deal within certain circles. Each one of these is huge, and it's a stumbling block, or it's a bit of wisdom. So that's what we're going to talk about. How can we find discernment? And hopefully along the way, you can witness to us this process, how you, as a scientist, theologian, works through these issues, right? Okay, so the first one is this idea that it's part of an agenda, or it's happenstance, never let a good crisis go to waste. So, the idea that, the government or big dollar is going to be able to put stuff in everyone's bodies is just this huge opportunity to, and why let that go to waste? Say, the Bilderbergers and so on. So what's going on with that?
Yeah, so I think I'm not sure where it all comes from, and it's coming from many in Orthodox communities actually, who are saying that there are some monks that are saying that we're putting microchips in vaccines and we're going to follow where everybody's going. I think it might come from the idea that Bill Gates has invested a huge amount in paying for vaccines as a donor. Okay, so part of his philanthropy has been to give a lot of money for development of different kinds of vaccines. And so then people think, oh, well, he must have ulterior motives in this. and it must be to put in microchips so you can track everybody and use those data by, his company to follow everybody around. The problem with that model, there are like several major problems. I mean, it's like the problem with any conspiracy theory. It's great to think about this like beautiful, cool, kind of almost fictional story of what could happen, and it makes for a good movie, but it's not actually the way real life works. First of all, right now the technology wouldn't allow it. I mean, microchips are actually pretty big, and you couldn't fit it through a needle to inject it into people. So at least right now, it's not even physically possible. But even if it were, the amount of complicity it would take from companies, physicians, everybody lined up to do that, I just think that's virtually impossible. And I don't know, at the end of the day, I think most people do trust their doctors to have good intentions and to be caring for them. I promise if you injected something like a microchip, you would see an immune reaction to it that would show up in the vaccine testing as a side effect. So, so these we trust our physicians to report accurately what's going on in these patients. They would see that. So I think that there are so many levels at which it would be problematic. I can't tell you. And even though I guess we can question a lot of what's been happening with the FDA these days and their, complicit relationship with the administration, I think that even still, the bulk workers. I mean, I have a lot of friends at the FDA. In fact, the director himself, I even know, and I don't think that they're bad intended people, nor that they want to hurt anybody. So I think they would never allow something like this to go through.
Yeah, great. So I want to follow up with a few things on this. So, yeah, you do get, monastic advice being offered on this. This is the memification of our wisdom, right? It's just so superficial. It's hard to track down, right? The isnad. Let's try to figure out how this got to us on Facebook or Twitter or whatever it is. But, okay, let's say it's genuine, because there are Orthodox Christian clerics, theologians, who, if they don't buy into any particular conspiracy theory, they are buying into some of them. What is, and this it's a problem for me because it means that we are not taking the problem of discernment seriously. We're not recognizing the role of humility in discernment. And, I hear, so who was it? Was it Laura Ingraham wrote a book? No, it was, somebody wrote a book, Shut Up and Sing, right? And the complaint this was a complaint from the right about, people who are experts in one field, like entertainment, just speaking out on policy that they aren't experts in, right? So they have this authority or they have this ability to manipulate opinion, but they haven't earned the wisdom, right? And there's this idea, especially among the pious, that monasticism and a life of prayer brings omniscience, clairvoyance, right? And I'm this far along on my spiritual walk, and the only discernment that it's brought me is the need for humility. It hasn't brought any of these epiphanies that I guess some people have. So can you speak about this that there is such a thing as secular knowledge that is gained not through revelation, but through an actual process?
Well, and I don't even want to separate it from revelation. I mean, I
Good for
think
you.
that to some extent, even the scientific process involves, some sort of revelation as you go through to know, and discernment. I try very hard to teach my students discernment with their experiments. Like, so, there's just like in many disciplines, in all disciplines, I would say, there's a critique, right? And when my students do their work, they present it, and there is a critique that comes from all the members of our lab first, and then from the broad community when they go to publish it. And that critique involves a discernment of, was this experiment done exactly right? Does this flow naturally from everything that we know in the literature, or is this something that is off the wall and needs to be explored in a different way. So there's discernment that goes on in science, and I think that there is also a degree of inspiration and intuition that comes with it that I think are actually God inspired, even if the person is non-believer. I think that that's the case. So then the question becomes: is the person who is praying, living a life of prayer without a lot of scientific knowledge, are they capable to have that kind of discernment? And I think that there are things that they can discern, but it's also easy to fall into, prelest, deception, where you are deceived about what you believe. And I think that a lot of these conspiracy theories are coming from a form of like self-deception, actually. But I do think that it's possible for at least a spiritual person to say, look, this person seems to be telling the truth. This seems to be accurate. I mean, there's a lot that you might be able to discern spiritually that may not have to do with scientific facts. So I think there's a balance, right?
Yes, and I love your point because, and your work, I encourage you to read Gayle's work. It shows how the process of discernment is one, right? If we are seeking truth, then we are seeking truth, right? And so all the things that are part of our spiritual process of discernment, beginning with humility, right, are also need to be part of our, if we're working as scientists, you as a real scientist, me as a social scientist, right? If we begin that work, even with the best of tools, best of instruments, without that humility, then it's going to go wrong. And someone who isn't trained in either of these, social science or the hard sciences, it's easy to get deceived. And that needs to be part of it too. That's why we have experts. And we're going to talk about this in a minute, is this problem about expertise right now in parts of our society. This I just want to throw an idea out for you to chew on. We can talk about it at a later date. But I'm a comparativist, right? And not because I think that history repeats itself, but because if you analyze the variables, if you have that kind of if you're that precise, you can see what the variations are and what the similarities are, and you can kind of discern patterns. And you get some leverage on today, I think, by looking back at the old believer or old ritualisticism, right? Because the most pious, right, were the ones who ended up being the most reactionary. Right, and part of this is because of the way that Russia inherited Orthodoxy. It inherited, around ritual. It didn't have that whole Greek, civilizational input, and so you hold on to the things that you know. And so when later on, the intelligentsia, the experts came in and said we need to modify our books so they match the Greek books. There was this reaction.
Yep.
And the fact that they couldn't trust the scholars, because the scholars didn't have it all right, but also because there was a level of distrust, you had a schism. And you look back and you're like, this is so tragic. Some charity, some communication, and some just Christian virtue could have saved a whole lot of trouble. And so that kind of dynamic I see as being here today. Because
I also think it's about trust.
Yep.
So had the scholars somehow worked to gain the trust of the people, it wouldn't have happened. And that's, I think, what the problem is in today's world with science, is that there's this tremendous distrust. It is about trust, I think.
It is, right. And people can look over the past year, because of the way our media is set up, to point out things that'll polarize us. So if you're part of that subculture that is not trusting experts, there's so much to point out about what the World Health Organization has done, what the administration, saying don't use masks early on, what that did. That's evidence. That's evidence that confirmatory. Just works with our psychology. They don't look at all the evidence. We don't, as human beings. We look at the ones that fit the idea that we're holding on to. And so it can reinforce this distrust of experts. Now, this idea that Bill Gates is behind this. Now, I don't know Bill Gates from Adam really, but we do have this tradition of philanthropy in America, right? If you go back, Carnegie, I probably said it wrong. That's how the city is called, right? Carnegie, in school, at least, in school I read his essay on philanthropy. And yeah, I mean, it's from an older generation, but the idea that if you have, you are required to, according to your worldview, share. And for Carnegie, that meant building all the libraries and stuff like that so that he could enable the cream to rise is kind of his idea. For Bill Gates, it's different. He sees, there are these technical problems that we can actually solve if we put enough, research towards it, and then we get it out there to people, right? And why do we distrust this? Why is it so easy for us to say, "Oh, Bill Gates, monster"?
Yeah, so so I'm reading this book right now. It's like I love Anthony Trollope, old British author who wrote in the late 1800s, right? And I don't think I understood the way they understood philanthropy as I do as when I read this book. So the idea was they were going through the potato famine. They've got all this poverty in Ireland, and people are not surviving. And they would go in the streets and ask a rich person to give them, some money. And the rich person's general response was not, I can't give it to you. I can't give it to you because the best way for me to get use of my money for you, for everybody, is to give it philanthropically and have an institution give it where they can get a bigger bang for their buck. So I give to you and it feeds 3 mouths. I give to them and they'll use it to feed 20 mouths. So I'm not doing the best I can for society by giving it in the way you want. And that was sort of one of the early, at least in the 1800s, that was one of the concepts of philanthropy in the UK, and I think that still is there, kind of in a different way. So with Bill Gates, he's had the Gates Foundation for years. He can give like money to one pocket or another pocket, but by giving large sums of money, say, to deal with famine in Africa, he can now put a lot of people to work to try to solve that problem instead of one little team that's going to do something. And that actually has been one of his big motivations, has been trying to deal with world famine, trying to deal with world poverty, and trying to deal with vaccines, which create without vaccines, people die. So that, I think, has been the model he's used. Now, you can claim he has ulterior motives. I don't know the guy, but the model he has is one that is well established and tried and true. And Carnegie was the same thing. I mean, if you give for libraries, you're giving to the masses. If you give 10 books to somebody, it's that person who they share it with. So I think that's the model for at least modern philanthropy that we use today. It is about trust to some extent, but most of these foundations are set up with, boards that are complex, contain a lot of people that work in broad fields who can actually, interplay ethics and dynamics and everything else. So, I guess we can call anybody into question at any time, but sometime or other we have to evaluate and decide this one's okay and this one's not.
Yeah, and this is something, speaking about the humility, right? This is the beginning of knowledge, is I don't even know my own mind. I've lived with this wonderful woman here. We've been married for 30 years. I can't read her mind. I try. I spend so much time, right? But I think that I have the ability, just based on a few data points, to figure out what Bill Gates' motivations are. Come on, we're not mind readers here.
Exactly.
We don't have that kind of thing. And so what does Christian charity demand? It's like, hey, this guy's trying to do some good in the world. Thank God.
Well, and sometimes it's like, by their fruits you shall know them. And there's been a tremendous good that's come from the Gates Foundation. I mean, you know, there are whole nations in Africa that have been fed that wouldn't have been fed without these programs that he's developed. The making vaccines available to the world has been a really big plus. He put a huge amount of money into HIV research, and now we actually have drugs. People don't die of HIV that much anymore. You know, so there has been a lot of plus that's come from that. I mean, I don't want to say that it's only his efforts. It's been the federal government and many others. But still, I mean, you know, you have to look at the fruits too.
Yeah, yeah, fantastic. And, you know, look, I'm not a big fan of big tech, right? I think we're still trying to figure out how this is going to work. It's all new. We'll figure it out. But in the short term, not looking so pretty, right? But one of the things you can say is that these guys, they've set up a sort of competition of charity, right? Which is what Carnegie was calling for. He was calling out all of the other, you know, robber barons or whatever to you know, help make society better. So now let's go on to that third point you made about the logistics of this conspiracy. Too many people involved. You can't keep that many people in, right? So I appreciate your point about, you know, look, if you tried to put something in somebody's body, you know, you'd have to follow up with a course of antibiotics and something. You can't put everything into one shot that's going to prophylact against it and allow the thing to work, right?
Right.
So,
exactly.
so that's one challenge, right? And the same would be true even if it were some kind of poison, right? Or some kind of, you know, testing. They're gonna give a third of us this. They're gonna give a third of us this, and so on. Now that kind of stuff has happened before, but on a much smaller scale. So when you know, those of us who look for excuses not to trust the government, you know, you look back and you look at the experiments that parts of the government have run on different populations. When they couldn't do it to Americans, they'd go afield, right? And we've, you know, just we're culpable for that, right? And a lot of damage can be done. This is
But we
huge.
did call, but eventually people called the government to task for that, right?
Good. Yes.
And it changed and created new ethical laws that made a difference. Now, it doesn't mean that the government always behaves ethically. It means that we need to keep watching, be vigilant in order to prevent that from happening again.
Right. And so you were speaking about how, like, even with a private foundation, which is what the Bill Gates Foundation is, there are laws about boards and about transparency and all this kind of thing. And it's the same. You know, people talk about concepts like the deep state, and there is an inertia to the state. Okay, Weber described it, right? But the idea that a bureaucracy can hold a conspiracy just doesn't work. I mean, within the government, within the intel community, which is the most secretive part, most isolated part, you have compartmentalized projects, right? They have to be kept small and very under tight hold in order for that to be maintained. It's not kept going for very long, right? This would require that on a scale. And let's face it, you know, bureaucracy. That's not the way bureaucracies are set up. And with Twitter and all this kind of stuff, not gonna be doable. So that's. Is there anything else that you wanted to say on that first idea that this would be used as some sort of, and you know, I was in the Army, right? And before I deployed to Afghanistan the first time, they pumped us full of all kinds of stuff. And I'm assuming that some of it was experimental, not like the, you know, what was that movie about Vietnam where they tested the LSD?
Oh yeah, I don't remember.
Tom Robbins, right? He was the actor.
Yeah.
Fantastic movie. Not like that, but like, you know, just let's see if this helps, right? And they tried different, malaria drugs and things like this, and they tried to watch, you know, what are the side effects versus the risk, you know, the risk reward and everything. The anthrax vaccines, all this kind of stuff. Let's move on to the second one, because they're not going to. Because your point, being an expert in this, is that there's a way that vaccines are rolled out. Now the second one, though, is your second point is The second argument is that many vaccines are derived from cells that came from two fetuses that were aborted in the 1960s. Both abortions were performed to save the life of the mother. Only some vaccines come from these cells, and they're used when other ones cannot be. So speak about that, and because this is the one that I hear the most often, right, is that when we take vaccines, we are participating in something that is abhorrent, right?
Yeah. So I mean, it's true. I don't think we should hide that fact, and it's not. And I don't think any of the companies that make vaccines try to hide it. The fact is that if people have tried, scientists have tried to make vaccines in other kinds of cells, and there is something very special about those embryonic cells that they're grown in that nothing else works. And try as hard as you can. Some vaccines, which were started originally to be in these aborted cells, have been converted over to other cell types, but there are some that can't be. They haven't been able to manage it. I would bet, but I don't know as a fact. I think that much of the COVID vaccine work is being kept secret because of intellectual property issues, I think, and because there's big competition going on. But I would imagine that those are going to be probably done in these same fetal cells that all the others have, just because we know that system works. Why would we move to something that isn't when we have such an urgent situation upon us? Okay.
Yeah, and you explained why we're not the first people to try and come to grips with this. So how does that work?
So there are a few things to note with it. I mean, I think first of all, it is from an aborted fetuses that were done. There were what we call therapeutic abortions. They were done in order to save the mother's life. So they weren't done just frivolously. The second thing is those same cells have been around since the 1960s. And because they are, we don't have to make new ones. We don't have to sacrifice another fetus in order to do it. We are living with the two lines that were developed in the 1960s. They've already died. We've already used them. It seems that it would be a real waste to now say we're not going to use them for anything. I mean, let us at least memorialize those two children and use them for the good of the world. The Roman Catholic Church has stated that while they note that this is a concern and that no new fetuses should die again, the good that vaccines do in saving lives is so valuable that we should continue with it. And at least I would say up until about 10 years ago, most Orthodox scholars agreed with that. I mean, bishops actually took some stands that were very pro-vaccine in that regard and lean in that direction. I think it's only been in the past few years with kind of this rising conservatism that I've seen there be a lot of arguments against it. Now, how much these vaccines save lives is incredible. Think about COVID now and how many lives we've lost and what a difference it would make if we had a vaccine. We have diseases that we use these vaccines for that are far more deadly than COVID is. So being able to protect ourselves from and the entire world from these infections is such an important thing to be able to do that the use of these vaccines is critical. Actually, you've seen in some locations where there's a group of people that says we're not going to do vaccines anymore. We have a low enough number of people, say with measles, where there are these huge measles outbreaks, and even some diseases that we thought were kind of wiped out. There have been a few ripplings of polio popping up worldwide, again because of this fear of using the vaccine. So it's especially sad when something's totally preventable, and we use some sort of machinations to prevent ourselves from being able to use it. So I think it's a big concern right now.
Right. Okay. So. Right, and you're not poo-pooing. You're not saying, oh, this is nothing to be concerned about. I want people to hear you and know your heart. Look, it may be the case, so this is going to be something that I'm going to get advice from bishops from you, is let's say that China, because, they're more willing to, I'm assuming, because they're a totalitarian government, that they're more willing to sacrifice individuals for the sake of, their purpose, right? And so, they probably have access to more of these lines. Is that, and does that
It's
give
very
them
likely that that's true.
does
It's
that
very
give
likely
them a
that's true.
competitive advantage in terms of the developing of a vaccine? Just looking at that kind of level of it.
I don't think so. I
Okay.
mean, I think that these two lines are enough to manage for everybody. So, I mean, across the world, I don't think there's a problem with that, and I don't think there's the need to develop new lines,
Good.
nor would anybody argue for it. Now, maybe, decades from now, those lines start to poop out a bit, and then we need to rethink things. But so far, there's not any indication that that's a problem.
Yeah.
Where China has a better advantage is that because they're totalitarian, they can test vaccines much more rapidly.
Yeah. They really
They, you
can
know,
run the experiments on their own people.
right, exactly, which we can't do, and I don't think we should, and I
Right.
feel badly that China's able to do that.
Yeah.
They should have things in place that stop this as well. In U.S., we're probably going to run it mostly on a volunteer basis, so at least initially, and that's been the case so far. Is that people volunteer to do it, and then they get tested, and we use the data from them to say, is this safe? And then the second question is, does this protect?
Yeah. So you're not saying we need to. I want to make sure that our listeners, our viewers, understand. There's no need. There's no call for. There's no support for. There's no moral justification for, sacrificing more to get new lines.
No, and if anything, there's a movement toward trying to come up with other approaches. So there's a lot of work that's going into, can we take fetal cells that are older than embryonic cells and modify them genetically to make them behave like embryonic cells, where we would have less of a waste? Or can we generate lines from in vitro fertilized eggs that are being discarded? I mean, I'm not sure the church would support that idea, but that's something that people have talked about, so they don't go to waste. But none of those have been successful yet.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Yeah. Just wanted to make sure everybody heard you on that. Okay. So this vaccine may well come from those sources from the 1960s, and that's just one of the like you said, the church, and you mentioned in your paper that the bishops have come out in support, and you just said it, bishops in support of vaccines. So they've done the prayerful discernment, and they've said, look, this is not a great world. Let's save lives. Let's take what we have and let's save lives, right? And as you point out, one of the wonderful things about our modern society is our ability to alleviate human suffering. There are still people who are suffering from poverty and, disease, treatable disease, but less and less every year,
Yeah.
and thank God for that. So the last one is something we've hit on a little bit, but this distrust, right, about the data. So this idea that here it's not a conspiracy, it's just incompetence. So they're going to field whether it's for monetary reasons or for political reasons or whatever, they're going to field a vaccine that is going to hurt people more than it helps people.
Yeah, I mean that's a problem. I think that I've had a couple of email responses from my article that I wrote, and what happens all the time is people say, here's this website that says that autism is caused by vaccines, right? I mean that's a common argument. Another common one is epilepsy is caused by it, and they send me and they send me this like one little clip from the web, and you can find anything on the internet, right? I mean anything you want, you can find it there someplace. But what I urge people to do, I know this is it's a painful process, but if you're really distrustful of it, the government forces all scientists must publish data, and that do it with government money, even with industrial money in most examples, have to put their data make it be available publicly. So there is a website that's called PubMed that contains all of the medical publications that are published worldwide pretty much in the medical field. So I tell people, look, if you don't want to trust what I say, I read PubMed. Go do a search on vaccines. You will come up with over 400,000 papers that have looked at vaccines from safety perspective and everything else. You will find some, people that are, looked at actually the issue, do vaccines cause autism? And the answer universally in all those papers is yes, no, they don't cause autism. Some people that are vaccinated do get autism, and they would get autism even if they weren't vaccinated. So you have to be able to discern in a population, would these people have gotten autism anyway, or did vaccination cause the autism? And in huge studies of, hundreds of thousands of people, at the end of the day, the data show that autism happens, but it's not a result of vaccination. And it's the same thing with epilepsy, and it's the same thing with many other causes, with many other diseases that we tend to attribute to it. Parent has their kid vaccinated, the kid gets autism, and they're like, it has to be the vaccine because this was the result of the vaccine. But in fact, there is a certain percentage of the population that would get autism anyway, and discerning whether that person is in that category or not is what it's up to the scientific literature and the scientists to do. So that's why I get very frustrated, because again, you talk about the experts. The experts go through these papers, they analyze these papers, they analyze all the data that exists, and they try to give you the best information they can based on what we know scientifically. What the public often does is read 2 or 3 websites and claim the same kind of knowledge that the scientist does. Right. So I say, go to the scientific literature, try your best to read it. There are some that are easily readable to the public. They're written for the public. Figure out from there.
Yeah, so there and some of these articles, what they do is they go through their meta articles, and they go through and they summarize the thousands of pieces of research that have been done. Now, as opposed to cherry picking a couple of studies that tell you what you expect to hear, right? And here's the thing about replicability, right? Sometimes, even with the law of large numbers and all this kind of stuff, when you do a study, you're going to get results that don't match, that aren't real. It's, I remember when we were, I was an intelligence analyst for a long time. And when we were in lead up to the Iraq War, right? What was the evidence that Iraq was stockpiling weapons of mass destruction, right? Well, if you look at the vast majority of the evidence, nothing. But if you pick out these 2 little things, it's very similar to that, except it's worse. Because in the intelligence community, there's deception and all this kind of stuff, so it's really hard to tell. But in the medical world, no, these are, sunshine shines on all of these experiments. And if things aren't replicable, they disappear, they get disproved, and they're gone. So another thing that undermines the stance of expertise and respect for them is, you have all these articles about p-hacking, about how you can change the way that you're setting up your variables so that you get statistical significance, right? And so, this made it into the general conversation about how, we were having a problem with repeating people's experiments. Thank you. Repeating people's experiments, that they weren't real, right? And then also a problem with people just going through and just manipulating how they're putting together their measures so that they get an effect, which is completely backwards, right? How is, and people use that, if I'm going to distrust expertise, I see that article about p-hacking, right? And I see this article about problems with replicability, and I say, see, I can't trust the experts. Can you respond to that as a
Sure,
scientist?
sure. So there are two things. There are two kind of cardinal rules of that go on with scientific research. Number one is that we have to trust that people are trying their best to be honest about their data, and there are honest mistakes. I mean, people do make mistakes that that student did something wrong repeatedly, and you didn't know it when you published it. So that's one problem. There are. I'm not going to pretend that everybody's great and pristine in the community. There are some people that lie about their data. I mean, they lie because of the sensationalism of getting a great story out there and getting all the publicity that comes with it. They lie because we live in a world where publication counts for promotion, and they need a paper, and they rush it out there. But the way in which science kind of corrects for that is this idea of reproducibility. So that's why I will trust the 400,000 papers that sit in PubMed. I might not trust any one of them, but I will trust all of them because science works as a body to self-correct. So when a person puts out a paper that is not correct or perhaps has alternative interpretations and they interpret it only one way, which I think is a matter of discernment, actually, um, then the literature will correct it eventually. And sometimes it's a very rapid correction. Sometimes it takes a year or two. But I think what we have to learn to trust is the body of literature, not any one paper. And that's kind of how science works.
Right, but it's not the way that Google searches work. And
No, it's
it's
not.
not the way the media works. So,
Yeah.
after you've been fed a few years of a diet of new study finds, right? And it's like you said, it's a sensational thing. And even if you look in that study, the media spin on it is sensationalizing usually pretty humdrum results, right? But after you get fed a diet of that, you're like, I can't trust this thing. It's a joke. It's a joke.
Yeah, and it's also the problem of believing the media versus the literature. So I joke about this, but this is really true. One week I was reading, New York Times or something, and it says blueberries are good for you, and you should eat blueberries all the time because they have antioxidants. Then 2 or 3 weeks later, there's another article that comes out and says blueberries can actually be carcinogens. Okay, and and I'm like, which of these stories do I believe from the media? Well, the truth is, I go back to the scientific literature, and it depends on how they did the experiment and what they did. Both results were true, but injecting blueberries causes cancer, yes, in some animals in large quantities. And yes, blueberries are antioxidants, and astronauts take them into space to eat them because they reduce oxidative stress. So both were true, but it's like how you present it and how you interpret it. And I think it's a problem of the media age where there's this, we have these science writers whose job it is to try to present science in a way in which it becomes interesting to the public, and they tend to make it be sensational. And I mean, having worked with science writers before and seen how they can really, not deliberately, but they can really mess up the science. And that they normally send it to me to check first. Unchecked, it would be a mess.
Right. Yeah, very good, very good. Yeah, so even though we have a distrust of science and experts, that doesn't mean that the community is worthy of that distrust as a community.
Right.
And yeah, this communal process of discernment, that's part of it. That's part of it, right? It's not through any individual, act of revelation or, of order. Yeah, it's when that's submitted to the community and the community verifies it. And until then, and even after then, we have to hold this finding that we have, no matter how much work we put into it, with humility. We have to hold it gently, right? Recognizing that our worth is not tied up in this thing. We have to be willing to let it go.
There's also the humility, I think, that's needed in, it is a mistake to think that science is not influenced by the outside world, that politics doesn't drive science, that, scientists are humans. We are influenced by all the things that go on in the world that surrounds us. And there are a lot of mistakes that have been made over the years. I always remember this study that was a scientific study that said that women can't accomplish the same things that men can. They have different talents, and they use scientific evidence to support that. And it was false. It was shown to be false later, but it took a very long time, and they were certainly influenced by the culture around them when they made those conclusions. So we have to realize that science is happening in history, in moment, in a world with political limitations. And that's why we need to have, first of all, that humility to recognize that we may be wrong, but also that kind of constant ethical checking that what we're doing is appropriate. And that's also where discernment comes in.
So one last question, because we need to wrap up. We both have other meetings to go to. So you are a committed Christian, given your life to Christ and to His church, and that means everything to you. And it has allowed you to become a theologian and a scientist, which are both expressions of the same heart, right? How is that heart respected within your community? This is one of those tales that's told about academia, right? Is that it is, if not amoral, I mean, it may even be immoral, that it is anti-truth, that it is anti-Christian, that it is anti all the things that we hold dear. You live in the middle of this. You're on these ethics boards. You're working with secular scientists and others. How does that look?
What I'll say is that I think it's a changing landscape. So 10 or 20 years ago, I would have told you that there was a very anti-religion component to everything, all of science. And I still think that there is a heavy anti-religion component, but more and more there's an openness to the fact that it's not that we are motivated and moved by things that are not scientific only. And it's that, like, family is important, love is important. When you start to recognize those things, there is a step into recognizing the importance of a spiritual dimension. And I've seen that much more now than I have seen in a long time. I think, the Black Lives Matter movement is changing the way universities look at themselves. And now, they're looking at themselves and saying, maybe this academic is all that matters is not the best way. Maybe we need to be open to other dynamics that are important. Maybe we need to be more diversified in how we think about things. So I think there's a change afoot. And I think it's a good one. I hope it keeps going on. I mean, it's like shocking to me. I worked with one guy for a while, and we were emailing. He said, "Oh, Gayle, I just decided to do a Google search and saw you gave a talk up at Holy Cross Greek Orthodox Seminary." I'm Greek Orthodox. Okay, now I've known this guy for years, and I didn't know that. Okay, so there's. I think it would have taken me much longer time to discover that than it is in these days. So things are changing. But I do think that this broader, at least belief in a spiritual dynamic, is coming into academics a little bit more. I will not say that there's not prejudice. I won't say that there is. I will say it's still not something that can be that openly discussed. But
yeah, but you do see maybe some of the fruits of the positive sides of pluralism, right? Where
yeah, I do actually.
Okay. That's excellent. Yeah, and so I'm also, in addition to political science, I'm also studying to become a special ed teacher, right?
Oh.
And one of the things that I really like about them, and at the University of Georgia, it's all evidence-based, right? This is all based on research. It's not like, oh, we need to help people, so let's try this. It's no, let's do some research and figure out how to help people with dyslexia how to read, right? And so you've got that, and then you've also got it's the very real effects of things like poverty and discrimination, right? That's where the rubber meets the road. And everybody agrees, conservative, liberal, that kids should not suffer.
Right.
Right?
That's right.
That every child should be set up for success. Everybody agrees with that. And they're actually working on how can we do this? How can we structure curriculum? How can we structure interaction with children in order to do that? And religion is a part of that story, right? And because it's, it's effective. So anyways, I am hopeful. And I think if we step outside of our media silos, that are telling us to justify ourselves and disrespect the other, whether it's experts, whether it's liberals, whether it's conservatives, Trump supporters, Biden supporters, whatever, step outside of that silo and just know the other person is human, that wants good for their family, that wants good for the people they love, and that is willing to bring you into that circle of love, right? And we should be willing to do that as well. I think, that's what you're doing in all your scientific work.
Yeah, and in the end, I think there's more that unites us than that divides us if you look at humanity as a whole. And I do worry that, the things that are dividing us are being the things that are emphasized instead of the things that unite us, which it seems like we're picking at a few things when there's a much bigger picture there.
Yeah, we do that within Orthodoxy, right? So,
Yeah,
I mean,
true.
I know when we catechize people, we're bringing them in, right? Oh, okay, so you were this. Well, here's what's,
Yeah. We also tend to categorize, like we put people into a little
a little
pigeon
box.
bucket.
Oh, it's so
Yeah.
fantastic. Okay, different conversation, different time. Gail,
Yeah,
so
exactly.
appreciate your
Oh,
time.
Father, this is so much fun. I love doing this with you anytime.
Okay,
Okay,
until
take
next
care.
time, everybody, Godspeed.